Writers have more power, people power, literally, than we've ever had at any other point in history because of social networking, because of things like Kickstarter, because of how huge these things get.
So I thought I would get us started by just asking, what is one work of sci-fi fantasy fiction that really affected you and why? I know, tough question. Don't all rush in.
Well, I'd be happy to start this one off. If I can talk about the collected works of a couple of people. Terry Carr and Judith Merrill were two anthology editors working Merrill sort of came first and Carr later, but overlapping some in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Together, they more or less, and with Gardner Dozois, created the notion of a year's best science fiction or year's best fantasy anthology. And some of my first introduction to the field was particularly through Terry Carr's anthologies. And in many cases, I was reading them years after they'd been published. So one of my favorites is the one from 1984, which is, I was 6 years old. I wasn't going to read it when it first came out. But discovering it as a teenager, the idea that you could make money by going out and finding the very best stories and bringing them all together and giving them to people in this one compact little package. These are little mass market books. Was just so exciting to me. It was really, it motivated me in a way that the idea of being a writer never quite had. And so when I say that Long Hidden is a dream come true, this really was my childhood dream, was to edit anthologies, to go out, to find the great stories and to put them all together and hand them to people and say, here, this is this sort of amazing little explosive device for your mind. And it will take you all sorts of places, one after another after another. And there's something really magical about a collection of short stories where each one is so different, and then you look at them all as a whole and the ways that they play off of one another. So it's very exciting to be on this side of the anthology now.
I was talking on Twitter today, actually, about how it's time to take Lovecraft's head out of being the statuette for the World Fantasy Award and put in Octavia Butler instead. Octavia Butler definitely is the most influential on me science fiction writer that I've read. Octavia would bring this analysis of power to storytelling that's unparalleled. She would go across all these different levels of speculative fiction. There's historical speculative fiction, there's ghost stories, spirit stories, there's sci-fi, hard sci-fi, vampires. But throughout it, she's talking about these layers of complexity in our human relationships with each other and with institutions and with history and with race and with gender in ways that never get in the way of the storytelling, but always buffer our understanding of the narrative, of the characters, of the depth of what's going on. And at the end of it, you're blown away, you're uncomfortable, you're aroused, you're confused, and you just want more. And so I feel like the full breadth of her entire work is so gigantic and powerful, and it's done so much for the genre. So I would have to say Octavia Butler as a whole.
Neil, what do you think?
I think there's been a bunch of different things that have influenced me. From the very beginning, when I first started reading science fiction, the first anthology to land on my lap, which is huge, Adventures in Space and Time, which is a classic science fiction anthology. And then later on, being influenced by the works of Philip K. Dick, particularly his short fiction, magazines like Asimov's and Omni and others of that time period. But I've always been a short fiction junkie. And the one that sort of pushed me with Clark's World, I think, was sci-fiction. Ellen Datlow's project with the Sci-Fi channel. And when that closed, that sort of inspired us to try and fill a void. So those all together influenced me in different ways.
I think that maybe what kicked off Fireside, there were a lot of different ideas coming together, but there was an anthology a couple years ago just called Stories that was Neil Gaiman and Al Sarantoni. And the idea of it was putting together a bunch of stories that were not necessarily, we're looking for science fiction or fantasy or this genre or that genre, but we're looking for just good stories and putting them together, and you sort of see how no matter what the storytelling device is, they're sort of, looking at different parts of the human experience, and it's just different lenses. And the idea that you could sort of do an anthology that way, when I was starting to think about starting the magazine, that was what really I thought would be something kind of cool to try and do, to try and pull together these different influences and put them next to each other, so that they could, sort of see that there's different ways to tell stories, but still, sort of get at the same parts of, sort of the same human ideas. So I think as far as the magazine went, that was a big influence for me.
I grew up in the former Soviet Union, so the access to the sort of science fiction and the authors and everything else that was available to me growing up was very different than to those of my generation growing up in the United States and in the West. The works that were available in translation were either in some way approved by the state, which doesn't mean that they were bad. There were some really wonderful short stories by Bob Silverberg and by Harry Harrison, Frederick Brown, and Robert Shackley that could be read as anti-capitalist. And so those were available to us. But a lot of the really great material that these other folks probably enjoyed growing up, I didn't have access to. And then very shortly, maybe 2 years before we left Soviet Union and came to the United States, I picked up a novel by Lee Brackett called The Sword of Rhiannon. It's not an award-winning book. It's not an annal of science fiction, but it's just a fun adventure romp. And it blew me away that a science fiction book or a fantasy book could be told as just plain fun. And so as perestroika happened, we started having access to more things like Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars series and Edmund Hamilton's Star Kings and things, Conan books, things of that nature. And so it always stuck with me how much fun you could have reading a science fiction story. It doesn't have to be all that serious. It doesn't have to be all that, it doesn't have to have a message necessarily. And so I think that in many ways influenced both my writing and influenced my desire to create anthology series that were a little bit more about just having fun. And so, in many ways, I think that was, even though the book itself, I barely remember it, but I remember its title and I remember how it made me feel reading it.
So most of you in your answers have touched on the idea of anthologies or collections of short stories, which is kind of natural since all of you are editing magazines and anthologies. Can you talk a little bit about the selection process and diversity in whatever format, and how you think about diversity and what you've done to increase the diversity in your magazine or anthologies, and whether you think that's important or whether you think there's something else that you strive more towards?
Well, of course it's important, because I think the genre is stronger by having a wide variety of voices telling lots of different stories. If we had the same story over and over again, it'd get very boring very fast. So having new voices, cultures that we don't normally get to encounter in our daily life, it's important. For us, we have open submissions online for the last 8 years, and we encourage submissions from all over the world. We monitor our statistics, keep track of gender ratios and what countries are sending us stories and where our readers are, and I've found that my own taste seems to not require me to poke at that too much, but it's a good sanity check to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And if I see somebody who's writing something interesting that we're not getting, then I'm going to reach out to them. And I think you sort of have to do that as an editor. You can't just sit back and wait for everything to come to you. You have to show that you're welcoming and encourage that kind of growth in the field.
Are there any countries that haven't been submitting that you wish would?
Well, my pet project for the last few years has been to try and encourage more translations, works in translations. And unfortunately, that's a very difficult side of things because you need a translator who's up to the task. They need to be a writer themselves. A lot of the translations they get are very academic and dry. They're very obviously somebody who might be good at translating nonfiction, but kind of lose something when they're trying to translate a story. So yeah, there's a lot of non-English speaking countries that I'd like to see more stories from. But encouraging that is very complicated.
Do you have relationships with translators that?
Well, we've been fortunate that Kenlu has translated a few stories for us. And in the months ahead, we'll be working on a much bigger translation project with a company in China.
That's really exciting. What about the rest of you? How do you think about diversity in your projects?
When I started the series, the anthology series, one of the things that we've decided to do was to have the associate editors read all the submissions blind. So they don't know who is writing the story. They don't know their background. They don't know their gender, anything about them really. And so to me, it was really interesting to see, well, would this have any sort of an influence on, what kind of trends would we see from that? And I was gratified to find that really the male-female ratio in what we're accepting and what's being bumped up to me is pretty much very similar to the ratio of what's being submitted. So we've been pretty good about it. We've been trying to kind of keep an eye on that, and make sure that make sure that we are looking, seeking out authors, and especially to echo what Neil said, authors from outside of the United States and outside of the English-speaking world. The first UFO book was the first time a short story by Sergei Lukyanenko was published in English. He is as well known and famous in Russia as Stephen King or Neil Gaiman are in the English-speaking world. So the fact that none of his work was available, his novels have been translated, none of his short work was available, was kind of a travesty, and we've corrected that. We're now talking to a couple of other authors from the former Soviet Union, not because they're necessarily better or than any of the other cultures. It's just that I speak the language, and so I'm able to go and read the short story collections and anthologies that are being put out, and actually seek out these voices, which I could not do in other languages. So that's been like our really small contribution toward the diversity thing. And I really echo what Neil said, is that we need to see more stories from from authors outside of the English-speaking world.
We just finished up a couple weeks ago a round of submissions, and we also do blind submissions largely because we raise our money through Kickstarter, and we don't want the anyone to be able to point us and say, well, that person gave you money, that's why you took their story. But the interesting thing, we bought 17 stories in this round, and the interesting to me is when I went and looked at all the names, 3 of them were by men, which wasn't anything we were aiming for. It was just something that kind of happened. And we kind of have said, we're looking for, a wide range of voices. And I think that the thing we need to try and do more of in the next round is try and reach out more to, we obviously, that's a great ratio of female writers, but what we didn't get is still a lot of, it's almost all US and Canada, it's mostly white, and it's something that we're trying to look at in ways of where can we get the word out that we're taking stories, because I think that's a really important thing, is making sure that you're talking to the different communities of writers, and if you don't have any sort of connection into those communities, they're never going to hear about you, and that's something that we're trying to work on. I mean, I've been doing this for 2 years now, and we're still trying to figure a lot of that out. But I think the other thing is that, as Neil said, if you say we're sort of missing something, you reach out and invite people, which is when we're doing our Kickstarters, we usually have a slate of invited writers, and that's something I've tried to be very conscious of looking at who we're inviting, so people can say, look, this is what we want the face of the magazine to look like, and I think if people see that, they'll feel more welcome in submitting to us. So.
Well, we invited a lot of submissions, and I think it's important to note that inviting a submission doesn't mean you're going to accept a submission. So I would say we accepted maybe half of the invited submissions that we got, and the rest just didn't suit us. They weren't right for the project for whatever reason. But that's why it's so important to reach out to a really broad group of people, because often you'll see these anthologies with very male-focused tables of contents, for example, and if you ask the editor why, they say, oh, well, I asked a bunch of women, but none of them sent me anything. Well, okay, so ask more women.
Right.
Like that's the solution there. Don't blame the women for not submitting to you. You go out and you ask more women. So we both reached out in different ways because we have connections to a lot of different marginalized communities. And it helped that the theme of Long Hidden is speculative fiction from the margins of history. So we were already talking about marginalized stories, and we knew that we were going to appeal to a lot of people who had experiences of being marginalized in whatever culture they were in, or had family history that they could draw on for the historical aspect of the stories. And we had open submissions, which I think are just essential. It's so important. Some of the stories we published were by people we'd never heard of. Some of them are the first professional publication for that author, and we could not have had that. We could not have had this wonderful work if we hadn't just opened the floodgates. I mean, it means a lot of work reading through the slush pile, but it's incredibly rewarding work. And beyond that, we looked at the stories that we wanted to pick, and as you said, we did the sanity check. We sort of went through and sorted it and said, well, here are the list of possible stories. Where are we getting a lot of stories from? Maybe we can tone that down a little bit and look more at stories that are set in other places with authors from other places, and really try and make it as broad a cross-section as possible. And it's not just geographical diversity or racial diversity either. We were actively looking for queer authors, for trans authors, for disabled authors. Again, any type of marginalization, anyone who has struggled to find representation and struggled to find stories where they see people like themselves.
Yeah, and along with that, I think the reaching out piece is so important. Also, when we take into account that science fiction and fantasy hasn't been a friendly genre to so many different folks who aren't white males, we have to think about that and be strategic in our outreach. So it's more than just like, let's find some POC authors that write sci-fi, but also let's reach into other genres and see what people are writing and ask them to push themselves. And see, there's a couple authors in Long Hidden that had never even thought about writing anything with any speculative elements. And some of them I dragged kicking and screaming to the table, and then the results were beautiful. And I think there's a freshness and a power that happens, not every time, but a lot of times when writers push themselves, when they take themselves out of their regular comfort zones. And I think that also ends up with you having a greater diversity of voices and tones. We don't often talk about the diversity of narrative styles, narrative arcs, just the different uses of language that we find. So I think that's another strength that happens when you're intentional about it, when you say like, we're not just going to have the same thing that we've been having. We're going to go out there. We're going to have people push themselves. We're going to push ourselves to, open up to different languages and different approaches to storytelling than what we're used to. And then what you come out with is something, just vastly more colorful and complicated and deep than what we're used to seeing, which is the goal.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a really interesting point. It's not just diversity of authors and their experiences, but diversity of styles and even subjects. Is there anything that you feel you would like to be seeing more of, or subjects you wish people would write about?
Asking that question of an editor is dangerous, because when we answer it, we get flooded with those stories.
You're going to get 100 of whatever you say right now. So
in general, I will say at this point, we're seeing more fantasy stories than science fiction, so I'm encouraging more science fiction. And I'm encouraging fantasy authors to submit science fiction because, like you said, pushing people to stretch a little is often good, and it's paid off for us in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And any other brave souls want to answer that question?
I would say that, and I was also talking about this recently, I'm just really tired of milquetoast protagonists. I think that fantasy and sci-fi both have a unfortunate trend to just have these sort of main characters that are just like amazed by the wild world around them, It's been happening for centuries. and fortunately, like, there's lots of writers that break that mold. But I still see so many books and movies and short stories where the character is very bland and the world around them is beautiful and complicated and well developed, and the sidekick has 10 times more personality than the main character, because the main character's whole purpose is to be amazed by what's happening and learn the magic, so they're kind of just a foil for the world building. And it doesn't ring true, you know, and I want characters that are not just flawed in the way that people, you know, have a flaw when you're in a job interview and they're like, what's your one flaw? And you're like, oh, I'm just so diligent. And you're like, no,
Yeah.
please. Like,
I work these late hours. My family hates it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, can you do better? And you get these protagonists, they're like, what's your one flaw? And they're like, I just care about my friends so much. I just really want to, and it's like, that's not interesting. You know, like, I really want characters that feel real and raw in that sense and, you know, speak to me on that level.
I read a really interesting piece today, and I horribly cannot remember the author's name, but it was about chrome women, the idea of seeing more female protagonists in their 40s and 50s, just badass women who get things done, and, you know, not the like wide-eyed milquetoast protagonist, but
Right.
The author was talking about just wanting to see more representations of people in a diversity of ages too.
And Cross Genres, we should say, has an anthology of sci-fi from the point of view of older people. Do you remember the name?
I don't remember the name.
But it's really
Yeah, Cross Genres in general, our publisher is great at all of these wonderful,
Yes.
they do a lot of themed anthologies with different diversity themes and unusual ones. They have one that's about queer families called Fierce Family. They have the one about older women. Winterwell.
Yeah.
A Fat Girl in a Strange Land, which is science fiction stories about large women. It's really awesome stuff. I'm going to build on what you said about seeing these badass women. It is not enough to have a badass woman. It's not enough. She has to actually do stuff. And I feel like there's been all this focus on strong female characters ever since Joss Whedon gave us the gift of talking about how great he is at creating strong female characters, which has been turned into GIFs that are all over the entire internet, and you will see them until the end of time. But your strong female character has to go out there and do stuff. So last night I watched the movie The Brothers Bloom, which had been recommended to me. There's an amazing woman in this movie. I'm not going to spoil it. But she is just incredible. She's very rich and she's very isolated, and her hobby is hobbies. So every time she sees somebody do something cool, she learns how to do it. So she can juggle chainsaws, she can kick ass, she can play 17 different kinds of musical instrument. She wants to learn how to blow things up with nitroglycerin. She's basically a superhero. And she does nothing. She does nothing in the movie. The central pivoting point of the movie is her literally going up to the protagonist and saying, I want to do stuff like you do, and him going, no. And the rest of the movie is about him trying to protect her from this life where he and his brother go out and do stuff because, God forbid, a woman go out and also do stuff like the men. So you have this great, strong female character. She's an amazing character, and it's like the writer wrote her and didn't know what to do with her. All he knew how to do with a woman was objectify her. And so once you have that strong female character, you have to give her space to do stuff. You have to give her opportunities to change her world in some way other than marrying the hero. You have to give her space to change her own life, to change the lives of the people around her, to change within herself, to do stuff. And that's what I want to see. Is I want to see more characters who are not the classic, 20-something, able-bodied, strong male protagonist. I want to see them doing stuff. I want to see them thinking and learning and changing and having conversations like adults, please, and like communicating with people like people do, and doing stuff.
And just to jump on that real quick, that's the most common narrative structural note that I've given to writers, both in Long Hidden and when I edited the Cross Genres music issue, was that there would be a strong female protagonist of the story, the main character, who would make it all the way to the climax of the story and then get saved. or just fall back and become passive. I mean, I can't tell you how many times that's been a structural issue to solve. And that's one of those moments where I think that there's a crossover in a craft failure and a political failure because it doesn't make sense narratively to follow a character all the way through to the end and then suddenly they become passive. But we're trained. I mean, I understand why it happens. You know, even today, even by writers that are very clear on their feminist politics, we are trained in that narrative story over and over. So we see it, and if we're not checking for it constantly, it comes out of us. And it just like when I realized how often I had to give that note, it really struck me. But I think it's something, it's like we have to always be checking ourselves and seeing like how does that play out, because it's true what Rose says. It's not enough just to have a badass character that's useless. It's like, what is the meaning of a protagonist, and how can we put that to use narratively?
Yeah, your protagonist has to protag, is what I tell the authors that I work with. And like Daniel, it's a note that I give a lot. I've just been editing a novel where a lot of really interesting things happen to the protagonist. And a lot of people have interesting things to say about her. And a lot of, she's in a lot of interesting situations, but she doesn't actually do anything. There's an entire book of her not doing things.
Milquetoast.
And I'm just like, just do stuff.
So you guys have all run great projects on the site. Can you talk to us a little bit about them? Did anything surprise you while you were running your Kickstarter campaigns and making the books afterwards and magazines? And are there any challenges that people should plan for if they run their own?
Well, I think this is a very open-ended question.
Yes, it is.
There's a lot of, if you ever decide to undertake this journey and publish a book through Kickstarter or in any other way, you're going to be surprised and challenged by many things, and you will be surprised and challenged by them again and again as you do this again. So you're always going to be learning new things. You're always going to be figuring out new ways to reach your audiences and new ways to promote the project, to figure out how to jump on somebody else's bandwagon, maybe that's, find a meme that's going on online that's very popular right now. And
you did that really well this week.
I
did.
did.
Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So there's a really fun contest that's being run by an actor by the name of Misha Collins, who is in a show called Supernatural. What he does every year is a huge scavenger hunt. And it's a scavenger hunt online where teams of people race to do very strange and unusual things. And they have to provide usually pictures or video of these things, and they score points for every scavenger hunt item that they've completed. For example, one of these items that is in the current contest is to stage a balloon fight to opera music, record it on video, and submit it. So there's things like that. Number 78 on that list this time around is to find a previously published science fiction writer and get him to write a story of 140 words or less, featuring Misha, the Queen of England, and an Elopus, which is half elephant and half octopus. So of course, I quote Cthulhuphant, but that's just me. There are a lot of authors that got mildly annoyed, to say the least, because all of a sudden, all these people, now mind you, there's thousands upon thousands of people who are playing this contest.
Oh, Jesus.
So all of a sudden, these famous authors, and the more famous you are, the more requests you get, are getting bombarded on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere, write us a 140-word story. And they're really annoyed by that. And so as I learned about it, I was also reading a post by a very smart writer by the name of Michael Bernstein, who basically took that and said, sure, I'll write a 140-word story for anybody who wants one, but you have to buy my book first. And you have to buy it direct from my publisher. Send me a receipt by email, whatever, and I'll write you a story. So I looked at that and go, that Bernstein guy is pretty smart. I should really use that. And since I have a Kickstarter project that's live, I posted a very similar offer and said, look, if any of you who backed my project are playing this game, I will write a story for you free of charge. If you would like for me to write a story for you and you haven't backed my project, do so, and you get a free story out of it. So to date, there are 13 or 14 teams that have taken advantage of my offer, but the amount of retweets and posts and page views that I got out of it, both on my blog and on Kickstarter, is astounding. There's way more people than that looked at it. And just to give you an idea of the scale of this thing, Michael Burstein, as of this morning, has written 54 of these stories. I don't know how he does it. I was having a hard time at 14.
Wow.
So you look for things like that. And any time that you can tap into something that's much, much bigger than our niche, the niche of whatever we're doing, and you reach beyond your friends and your friends' friends who make the core of people that back you on Kickstarter, you can do great things. And so you have to just find these things. And this week I was fortunate to find that one thing. But there's others, and they're always there, and you have to be looking if you're running a campaign.
Were there anything, I'm sure there's a lot of things that you guys all did that worked well, but did anything stand out as working particularly well?
For me, it was last minute panic every time.
Heard in your book.
It's sort of become a running joke.
It kind of has, and I think it's actually an entertainment service that Fireside provides, but most of our Kickstarters have funded on the last day. The last two have had to raise about $12,000 in the last 24 or 36 hours. One of them funded with 12 seconds left. But the larger point from that is that the thing that surprised me coming out of doing a Kickstarter, having not really any experience, is the experience of building a community around your project, which is something I didn't really think about when I started, even though it's crowdfunding and you need people and you're bringing them together. But the idea that you've created this community of people who really do care about what you're doing, and at the end when you say, hey guys, I need to raise $13,000 by tomorrow, and then it happens and you're like, how did that happen? And you really start to think about, that people have really connected with what you're doing, and that it's not just, oh, I'm creating a magazine. It's, people really buy into whatever idea for your project, and you don't have to fund with 12 seconds left for that to be true. I mean,
thank God.
Long hidden, I see all the time people are still, using the long hidden hashtag and talking about it. And, you guys have a really great community built around that. And that was the thing that was probably the thing that surprised me the most and should have surprised me the least.
Rose and Daniela, did you have a community to start with, or did you build that up?
Well, we had many different communities, and we were both part of many different communities, and then we created the long hidden community, or it kind of created itself. We were both stunned. We had over 1,000 backers for our project, and neither of us expected anything like that. And the extent, many of our authors were telling us about how amazed they were to be part of something that people were talking about like this. And when you mentioned the hashtag, it helps when Daniel tweets a video that gets 150 retweets with our book hashtag in it. Thanks, Daniel.
Hey.
Yeah, people talk about it all the time as they get their copies, as they read the book. They tweet with the hashtag so that they can find other people who've read it and talk with them about the work. So it's a community of readers, a community of people who really want to read these stories.
Yeah, definitely we have to shout out Bart Lieb, who's the publisher, one of the two people that runs Cross Genres, Bart Lieb and Kay Holt. Bart was the guy really pulling the strings with the Kickstarter. So the fact that it was as huge as it was, I think, is a combination of his being a really badass Kickstarter runner, and us doing something, also us, like you said, bringing our communities together, which was huge. And us doing something that people were really palpably hungry for, and doing it in a way that I think felt accountable to people. They were excited, and they said, oh, this is something, it was literally the outpouring of it came out of a conversation on Twitter, where people were talking about representation in science fiction, specifically of Black women. And, the next day, Cross Genre was saying, well, yeah, we really should do what Rose had suggested, which was do make an anthology.
It was just like a joke.
You were kidding,
I was like,
right?
hey, that sounds like a Cross Genres anthology.
Right. But I think it makes sense that it came from that medium, and it was really also exploded by that medium, because we were blown away by the Kickstarter. I think we funded in 3 days, and then we tripled by the end, which blew us away, blew everybody away. And definitely, we're still riding on that momentum, because the hashtag is still alive. Because of the book, too, of course. But it started with the Kickstarter, and that was huge. So yeah, I think it's you have to know what you're doing, and Bart really knew what he was doing. He did a lot of the research, and he passed that on to us, and so we could be his minions. But you also have to find something that speaks to people. And I think all these projects, speak to people on levels, and that has a lot to do with their success. And it's that combination. It's a little bit of magic because you can't exactly quantify it, why something really like clicks with more than a couple of people, but then it does.
And I think it's like, in some ways, the person who kind of popularized crowdfunding was Barack Obama. And we had a very similar structure, which is where we had a few very highly placed, very influential people. Neil Gaiman tweeted about our Kickstarter. It's very nice of him. We got featured on Boing Boing. John Scalzi wrote about it. These guys are great. They have enormous audiences. But we also, and I think in some ways, had much more success with just individual people going, I want this book. Please help make this book happen.
Right. Yeah,
and that was mostly communities of color. That was queer communities. These were people with maybe 30 Twitter followers or 100 Facebook friends, but they were going out and sort of doing this grassroots work and saying, help us make this happen. Help us get these stories. And that was what made it happen in the end. You really can't. It was wonderful if you can get some promotion in big outlets or get some big attention or attach yourself to something like this scavenger hunt where you get a lot of attention from people who wouldn't have seen it any other way. But it's absolutely essential to find the people who want what you're making. And they are motivated. They're motivated to help, and they're motivated to reach out to their own networks and help to build this kind of community around what you have.
Yeah, I think it's also, you've got two pieces of your community. You've got the community that's supporting you and the community that's sort of behind you, sort of helping out there. And I'll say that if you run a campaign, talk to somebody who's already run one and get some feedback from them. I had Alex and Bart both give me some great advice early on. I think the project was stronger for it. And I think people see that when they look at it. I think the worst part for me on the whole campaign was making the video. I have to thank my wife and my children for their involvement there. But yeah, you don't have to do it all yourself. That's the important thing. I mean, your community can do more, can help you, can be there for you. In my case, the project was very personal, was triggered by having a heart attack, which is not an approach that I recommend for anybody. But it's good if you can tie it to something that will resonate with other people, like they've said, and building the right team behind it, I think, is critical.
And if I could just add one really quick thing, the two examples that you just heard are actually very typical of a successful Kickstarter campaign in the publishing field. Very few sort of glide their way, comfortably to success. You are either going to have a campaign that funds super early and then goes on to superfund, which is Mark Blake, I think, coined that, to double or even triple. We'll have to coin another word for that, for long hidden. And then you're going to have campaigns that are going to struggle, and the fact that there's any possibility at all that they might fail will so much fire up their base that they will raise $12,000 for Fireside. They will raise $2,000 or $3,000 that we were short on the last day of the campaign that I did for UFO 3, and we funded with 15 minutes to go. So and then I've had other campaigns that funded with in 3 days. So it can go either way, and you have to be prepared for the emotional roller coaster ride that goes with doing a crowdfunding campaign.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I really don't want to downplay that. We did a tremendous amount of work, and Bart and Kay really both were handling things like fulfillment, going out and finding people to contribute prizes for higher levels of funding, and they were offering up other cross-genres books to be bundled with this one for people who backed at higher levels. They did all of the shipping, which I cannot even imagine. Just the fulfillment alone is a tremendous amount of work. But we were out there for 30 days, knocking on doors, sending emails. I lost count of how many emails I sent to people I knew or barely knew, saying, "So we've got this amazing project. Tell your friends. Please tweet. Yeah, yeah. Don't reach out to people you don't know. That's definitely important. But you're gonna find yourself working really, really hard for this, basically from before the Kickstarter goes live, when you're figuring out what you want your reward tiers to be. And again, really, I have to echo what Neil said, talk to somebody who's done it.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be out there and suddenly find out that you have a $1 tier and a $10 tier, but all of the people who would be backing you really want a way to back you for $5. So you have to know, kind of know your audience, know what their budgets are. If you're offering an ebook, you probably don't want that to be a $15 reward because people aren't used to paying $15 for ebooks, even if that's what makes sense for your budget. You have to think about what's going to make sense perception-wise. We talked a lot about paying, how much we were paying the authors, because that's very big. People in our community care a great deal about authors getting pro rates. Didn't talk at all about how much we were paying the editors, because no one cares. But it just, it wouldn't have made as much of a difference for the optics, I suppose, is what the kids say these days. So you have to think about what's going to play with your audience, and starting from that all the way through those very, very intense 30 days to after, when you have to fulfill everything and also do the project and also make sure you pay your taxes and keep track of your accounting and all of that. It's a lot of work. You're running a business, and you have to treat it like running a business or you will just keel over.
Well, I was going to open it up to questions on that note.
I don't want to discourage anyone. I mean, the Kickstarter was tremendous for us. You just have to really understand what you're getting into.
Oh, there we go.
How do you choose what gifts or prizes or whatever you call it that you give for tiers?
Well, how do you choose what to sell at a garage sale? It's what you have in your house, right? I mean, it's what you have access to. It's what makes sense. So Julie Dillon, who did our fantastic cover art, is doing a Kickstarter right now for an art book. So she's doing things like prints of the art. There can be small prints or large prints or pairs of prints or a whole pack of 10. People will get access to a video of her showing how she makes her art. These are the things that she has access to. It wouldn't make sense for her to offer like carnivorous plants or other things that have nothing to do with her project. So it really depends on what you're making. Like I said, cross genres offered other books. We offered to write a song for our backers, which we really ought to do.
We're going to do that
at some point. And
not right now.
not right now. Not here on stage, but. We looked at our talents and said, what do we have to offer? I've contributed editing services for other Kickstarters. So at a certain tier, you can get a critique from me. That's the skill that I have to offer. So it's the same with the crowdfunding. You reach out to your network and you say, well, maybe you can't give money, but do you have a signed copy, a signed first edition of that novel you wrote that we can add as a reward? Things like that.
And we generally find that when people are running a Kickstarter, what backers most want is a copy of the thing itself. So for a publishing project, an ebook or a printed book or a signed book, and then experiences. So at the higher levels, getting editing by Rose or getting to meet the author or something like that.
Another simple one, particularly for a book project, is to thank them in the book. At the back of Upgraded, there's an entire chapter of honorary cyborgs, people who supported at a certain level. I've done the same thing with Clarksworld. We have Citizens of Clarksworld for people who support us. So it's a little thing you can do. It doesn't cost you anything aside from adding a few pages to the book, which is negligible. But it's a nice way to say thank you.
The advice I always offer is to look at a number of successful campaigns that are very similar to the campaign that you're doing, and then look at what rewards the people have chosen. So if they're offering a reward and only like 5 or 6 people took that up, probably wasn't a good match. But then sometimes you'll have a reward that'll surprise you. You'll have a reward that you'll think only a few people will want, and everybody is jumping on that. So look for those trends.
Right here?
So my question is kind of where do we go from here? Kickstarter is awesome. It's a way to get projects off the ground that maybe necessarily wouldn't otherwise come into creation. But as you said, it's a ton of work. It doesn't seem like a sustainable way to run a magazine or a publishing company. So how do you kind of harness that crowd power of Kickstarter into something that doesn't have a 30-day roller coaster once a year or once every month?
We're still working on that. That's why I've had 5 Kickstarters. I think it's true that, you know, if I did a Kickstarter for Fireside every year for the rest of my life would not be very much longer. But I think that you sort of have, like, what I said about building communities is that Kickstarter has allowed me to form a community around Fireside, and that's really what you have to look to, is you have to say, we have these people now who are really interested. How do we take this and move forward with it if you're working on some kind of an ongoing project? And I think, you know, with all of the digital tools and everything that are available now, it's sort of, there's a lot of room to experiment with that, and that's what we're trying to do.
This is one of my pet peeves, actually. That you know, I've said it at science fiction conventions. Kickstarter is not a business model. You should have a business model before you launch your Kickstarter campaign. You should actually say in your Kickstarter campaign, this is how I'm going to sustain what I'm doing, if it's an ongoing project. With magazines, there's lots of opportunities. You need to have that audience. If you can roll that Kickstarter group into subscribing, then you have an ongoing thing. There's also a service called Patreon, which is for ongoing projects as well, that sort of crosses Kickstarter and subscriptions in a tight mix. There's selling ebooks, creating anthologies out of a year's worth of it. We have, God, I can't count the number of different revenue streams we are constantly trying to experiment with to make Clarkesworld succeed. My next Kickstarter campaign will probably be something for the magazine, but it will be to launch the funding for something that we intend to continue after that. And as part of that campaign, I will specifically say what we intend to do, because I think that's important.
Yeah, what Neil said is really important, because what I always tell writers is that they have to approach marketing and social media presence and all these other things with the same sense of creativity that we approach the blank page. Because we tend to separate those things and be like, oh shit, I have to market now, I have to be socially media present and all these things. And that's obviously a no-go, because you're miserable doing it and it's not natural to you. But if you're a writer or if you're an editor, you know, you're a creative soul and you have to bring creativity to it. So bringing in lots of different streams and income streams and thinking about different ways of sustainability is something that, it's a conversation that has to happen. I know Cross Genres is having it, we've been having it with Cross Genres, and there's lots of different approaches. Definitely, I think this isn't something they're doing, but I think incorporating is something to think about. Nonprofit, very complicated, very difficult, also probably more difficult than having a Kickstarter as far as paperwork, but certainly something to think about, and there's models out there. The problem I have is when we're having the conversations about diversity in the industry and people say, well, you know, go with the independent publishers or kickstart your own magazine, which is a great solution, but it can't be the solution. And it's often brought forward is that, well, there's Kickstarter, what's the problem? You know, why do you have to go with these big marketplaces? You know, who cares if they're racist, you can Kickstart. Obviously, that's not a solution, but you'd be surprised how often that comes forward as the solution. So, you know, we have to look at it for what it is, which is this huge, amazing gift and the ability to create a community, get ourselves out there, you know, make our project much long hidden, again, became really well known in large part because of the Kickstarter, but as a sustainable thing, very dangerous for your health.
Yeah, I would say that Kickstarter is great as a thing that you do multiple times if you treat it like taking pre-orders. Because as Margot said, what people mostly want is the thing you're making. So if all of your Kickstarters are about offering really cool swag, that is not sustainable. And if your Kickstarters are sort of a fancy way of going around and asking a lot of people to donate to your cause, more or less, if you're thinking of it as donations or as gifts of money, then that is also not sustainable, because you know that if you go to a friend and say, lend me $5, your friend says, okay. But if you go to that same friend every week and say, can I have another $5? Eventually the friend's like, no.
Right.
So people burn out on being asked to give money, but they burn out much more slowly, or maybe not at all, on being asked to pay for a thing they want. And so those two different approaches, I mean, each one has its points. And people donated to the idea of long hidden. People maybe bought hardcovers who didn't really care if they got a hardcover. They might not have bought a hardcover in the store, but they wanted to support the concept of the book. But if we did a long hidden too, people would basically just want to pre-order the book. And so if we did a Kickstarter where there was one reward tier, and the reward was a copy of the book, and the cost was the cost of the book, which is basically Kickstarter as a way of taking pre-orders, would probably be about the only doable way to do it. But on the other hand, there are other ways for publishers to do that that don't require giving the 5% cut to Kickstarter and the 5% cut to Amazon payments. So that's sort of where the future is. Once you have your audience, you can keep giving them what they want, as long as you are actually giving them what they want. And they will keep giving you money for what they want, but you have to understand the relationship is on that level after the first initial rush of enthusiasm and, yes, please, let me throw money at my screen, let me support this idea. People will support an idea once, but they'll buy your books forever.
Mm-hmm.
Jumping off of the point that Daniel made, do you feel like in publishing, because there are so many publishers that are not interested necessarily or want proof that books that aren't sort of just about mainstream subjects, mainstream types of characters, is Kickstarter or projects like these on Kickstarter proving that those are viable books? And do you see that as something that is going to influence publishing, or are publishers going to keep letting people doing Kickstarters and not take chances themselves? That's
such a great way to frame it. I think both are real, both are happening. I will say that you hear that, you hear people talking about that, like, well, there's a Kickstarter, like I said. But you also, I would say right now, in this moment in time, writers have more power, people power, literally, than we've ever had at any other point in history, because of social networking, because of things like Kickstarter, because of how huge these things get, because the concept of going viral has never been so real as it is now. And I can very much tell you that publishers know that and are aware of it and are in a way terrified of it, because never before has a writer had 8,000, 20,000, 100,000 people at our fingertips that we can just talk trash about publishers to and have an effect. And yes, the Kickstarter campaign has proven that to another level, because then it's shown that we can also put money to where our mouth is. So both are true, and it really depends how we as editors, as writers, move forward with that power and with the knowledge of that power. But people have noticed it. People inside the industry have noticed it. It's changed the way that I've been told personally that they sat me down and they were like, we will never whitewash your covers. First of all, we wouldn't want to do that, but second of all, we see what you have done with people. Like, we see what kind of power you have, and we're not going to mess with that. So it's real. But then it's like, how do you harness that? How do you understand it? How do you make it work for you? Because they will do the other thing, and they will throw it back at you and say, oh, well, you go forth and market, and then we don't have to, which is another problem.
I have a question for Neil. More and more publishers are coming out with digital-only imprints or ebook-only imprints, and more self-publishing is becoming more common. Do you think that is going to challenge online, fantasy and sci-fi magazines, which seem to have, kind of a mark in that? But that's really the only thing that they have. What do you think is going to be a future for online magazines?
I'm not worried about it. The online magazines didn't kill the print magazines. There's an audience for all of these people. Basically, when you subscribe to a magazine, you're subscribing to an editor's vision of what they think is good. So you're buying a brand, essentially. That's what makes it very difficult for a lot of self-published authors who don't have an audience. Is that they have to find a way to be heard. Whereas if they sold that story to a magazine that already had a brand, they'd sort of gain some benefit by association, and maybe be seen by 30,000 people where they might have only been seen by 100 on their own or more. And sometimes lightning strikes. Sometimes they do better than the magazine. So it's not something I'm terribly worried about. I'm basically self-publishing myself as an editor. You know, it's my magazine. It's kind of amusing to me because the obstacles the self-published authors are facing right now are the same things that online magazines went through 5, 6, 7 years ago. And we're already through that, and now we're just, you know, now we're viewed as colleagues by our professional colleagues, and I think at some point you're going to see that sort of level out. There's an advantage to each distribution system, and that's all it is. It's a different distribution system.
Do you think the same applies to e-only imprints from like Harper's? There's like a Voyager Impulse and stuff like that?
I think that in this day and age, it's a little foolish to write out print or write off print. There's still a large number of people who read print only. It's one of the reasons why we publish a print version of the magazine and an annual anthology is to reach that audience. As the publisher, I feel I have a responsibility to my authors to make sure their stories are seen by the largest number of people possible. So we do print, we do audio, and we do online, and we do ebooks in different formats. I think that's good business for everybody. E-only imprints, I think they still leave the opportunity open for those things to be in print, assuming that they're not grabbing the rights. And without seeing those contracts, I couldn't comment.
I would like to chime in a bit. I don't see those contracts either, but I see a lot of those books for my day job at Publishers Weekly. And my understanding is that for many, many of the publishers, the digital only or the digital first imprints are a way of seeing whether something is popular. And if something is popular, you'll do a print version. And it's the same thing with a lot of authors who self-publish and get real success with it will then have publishers, traditional publishers, knocking on their doors saying, please let us do a print edition of your book. So, you know, if I've got books coming out from Harlequin, for example, from their HQN imprint that started out as online romance novels. And then Harlequin was like, wow, there's clearly an audience for this. I bet these people would pay $8 for paperback. And so they go and they get the series, which is already written. So much of the work is already done, established fan base, great marketing. And they just take that and say, you know, we're going to do print editions. They'll have nice covers. We'll make sure it's all proofread. You'll be a professional job. But you have done most of the work for us. And then we will give you an additional way to reach your readers. And those kinds of hybrid arrangements, which I think is what authors call them, they can be very, very good for both the authors and the publishers. So basically for both traditional publishers and individual authors, going digital first or digital only is a great way to kind of stick your toe in. There's not as much resource commitment up front. There is some, because you still need to pay for the cover and the editing and so on, but there's not as much. And if you hit it big, then you can look at your other options.
I think that's all the time we have for today, but I really appreciate everyone coming out, especially the panelists. And yeah, thank you.